Hey friends, welcome to today's podcast. I'm so glad you're here. Something I want to talk to today is about how control happens and why we feel like we need to have control in our marriage or if our spouse has control. And this is especially prevalent after betrayal. That's what I'm going to talk about. And I think we all sometimes feel like people are trying to control us, or we realize that we are trying to control other people. So just take note and be curious if this is happening in your experience in your life. And I think sometimes they both happen. Control often gets mislabeled as I'm just trying to be careful. I'm trying to be cautious. I'm just protecting myself, or I just need reassurance. So sometimes we sugarcoat or label control as something different, but we need to get to the root and see, oh no, actually I'm trying to control the situation. And so there's always something deeper going on. And I think control often, it totally shows up after an affair is discovered. I think it looks different for men and women. And I just want you to figure out how you can tell the difference if this is a healthy boundary or if it's fear driven by control. So the reality is humans like to feel in control. And I think we all have different character flaws. If we don't let people know this about us, or we're going to hide it, camouflage it under something else, so we aren't perceived as controlling, but it's really easy and it feels off. People can tell if they're getting controlled. And just know this is a human response. It's a survival skill. Our brains are wired to predict and manage our environment. We are always scanning to see, are we safe? And if we don't feel safe, we do get on high alert. Our nervous system is always trying to scan to see if we're safe or not safe. And an affair feels very unsafe. Betrayal feels unsafe, and we don't want to feel pain. So we're always trying to prevent negative emotions, but obviously we're human, and so we're going to have those negative emotions. When you are trying to control, that might look like you're trying to control gathering information. You're trying to search their cell phone or their emails or text messages or Facebook or Instagram. You're searching for information because you're like, if I can find out a few more bits of information, then I can make my decision. Then I can feel like I'm safe. Then I can feel like this will never happen to me again. But the truth is that is just going to keep you stuck and spinning. We want to try to control people's behavior. So sometimes we yell. I feel like when people yell, sometimes that they're trying to get you to shut down. They feel it's like a sense of control. And so paying attention to what your behavior is or what someone else's behavior, if they're trying to control you, trying to guess the outcome. The thing is, we don't know what's going to happen in our future. And we might do all the things. We might have an idea like, okay, if we do these 10 things, I'm going to use children as an example. If we raise our kids these 10 ways, they're for sure going to get married, get a college degree, have an amazing job. They're going to love their mom and dad forever. They're going to have 5 kids or 3 kids. We can be grandparents. We have this idea, but we think if we do these 10 steps, then we will ultimately control what our children, who they are and aren't. I guarantee that's a recipe for disaster because we do not have any control over our kids, especially when they're adults. They get to choose who they want to be. And that can be very frustrating and disappointing for parents, just like our marriages. Think if we are this certain way, if we do these things, our spouse will never have an affair. We have no control over if they're going to have an affair or not. Even after we reconcile, there's always the possibility. So we just have to focus inward instead of outward because we have no control over what other people do. And that's hard for our brain to understand and realize. So control becomes a problem when it starts to override your partner's autonomy. They are their own person and you are your own person. When we try to control who they are and they aren't, that becomes a problem. It's not going to be helpful. So many couples get stuck in this. They have all these demands. And so that gets complicated. You can't talk to this person. You can't look at this person. You can't send an email to them. And we get all these rules. Now, in general, of course, we need to have guidelines and parameters around the opposite sex in marriage. But when we get too finite and too specific, it suffocates that person and aren't able to even feel like they can make their own decision. And that becomes a problem because we sometimes want to rebel against that and do something that maybe is out of character for us. So we focus on the behavior instead of addressing the fear underneath it. So really pay attention to what you're afraid of. Control doesn't look the same for everyone, and it often looks different depending on whether you were betrayed or the one who had the affair. So the betrayed might feel different than the betrayer. I think our genders are important. Male or female, I think, respond differently to control, and how we were taught in our childhood. Our childhood shows up so much in our marriages and in our adult life. I think we're now understanding that more as a society, how much our childhood affects us, good and bad. But what were we taught as far as our emotions and what power felt like? And if we were controlled a lot as a child, how does that show up in our adulthood, in our marriage? If a woman is the one who cheated, control often shows up as guilt-driven urgency. And I totally see this. They feel a lot of guilt. And so they want to rush to go to couples counseling and they start over-functioning emotionally. They might be overly affectionate to their spouse, or they're trying to get the relationship back to normal very fast. Any of those things are just going to hurt more than help. It will be the job of the spouse who had the affair. This is a woman that I'm talking about, to figure out how can she control herself so she's not showing up this way, because that is just going to push someone away. It's going to be helpful. And a man might be like, yeah, I don't want to feel this way anymore. I'm just going to brush it under the rug. But I guarantee it will eventually come out, and it might be 10 or 20 years, but then you're still dealing with it. Instead of healing it in that moment, you're going to deal with it now 20 years later. And that is going to be hard and hurtful and painful again. Why we want to rush to get our relationship back on track is because it feels painful, and that pain is real, but we need to sit in what we did instead of just gloss it over. And I know that feels hard and unbearable, but that's the way through it, is to feel it and not control, escape the guilt or all your pain that you feel that you've now just dumped on your spouse. That's very painful. When women are betrayed and not the betrayers, control often centers around emotional safety. Their need to understand why it happened, what it meant, whether it will happen again. We have all these questions. I totally relate to this. I wanted to know why. And are you going to ever do this again? Of course, my spouse said, no, I'm not. Did he? Absolutely, he did. So if that need isn't met, control can come out sideways, like emotional outbursts, yelling and screaming or crying uncontrollably. First of all, I'm not telling you this, I can judge myself. It's just to notice, this is interesting. This is what control looks like. It can come out in shaming ways. We feel shame and then we're blaming our spouse, or we shame ourselves. Repeated and constant questioning. Now, of course, questioning is important, but when it's happening over and over again and you're getting the same answer, we've got to eventually just decide, do I want to believe what my spouse is saying? Do I think he's telling me the truth? Now, if I don't think that, that is something to be curious about, but it's not your spouse's job to fix. It is your job to figure out, okay, what do I want to do now? If I refuse to believe my spouse, he's told me 500 times that he ended the affair or whatever your questions are, and I get the right answer consistently, that's something going on inside of you that you're afraid to believe it, or you're resisting it for some reason. Trying to extract reassurance through intensity. People begging to their spouse so they can feel reassured. There's not anything they can say to reassure you. You have to reassure yourself. There are things that they can say that will help, but ultimately you have to be the one to calm yourself down, regulate your nervous system, and reassure yourself that, you know what, I believe my spouse that he's never going to do this again, or they're never going to do this again. But if he does, I'll be okay. I'll figure this out. So remember, control is about power. It's about desperately trying to feel safe again, and you're doing that through control. But the reality is we have to let go, release, relinquish the what ifs and the control and learn how to feel safe in our body, regardless of what our spouse is doing or not doing. So when men have an affair, control often shows up as defensiveness. This can look like, and I relate to this too, minimizing what happened. Oh my gosh. The amount of minimizing my spouse did is devastating and just laughable, in my opinion. It wasn't that big of a deal. I only had affairs for a few times with a few women for a few months out of our marriage. So painful because that wasn't even true. But they minimize it to justify it to themselves, and that can be a form of control. Blaming circumstances on our relationships. Now, women do this too, right? If you would have been nicer to me, if you would have met my needs more, I wouldn't have had an affair. And that's a lie. That's their way of trying to control you into submission or just agreeing with it or trying to get over it. And so many of us, and I've done this, we allow them to control us. And when you recognize it, it's, oh, I'm sad I did that. It's not to judge yourself. It's just to notice like, oh yeah, I've totally done that, which yes, I've totally done that. Avoiding accountability. They don't want to be accountable. Becoming aggressive or emotionally shut down. I think this happens a lot with betrayers, men. I know women do this too. So I hate to gender things, but I'm trying to separate them. And you could recognize some of your spouse's behavior on the women's side or the men's side and vice versa. So these are ways that they just try to control. Control here is often about protecting identity and avoiding shame rather than repairing trust. And I agree with this because they would rather be perceived as a good guy that made a mistake. It's not a mistake, it's a choice, but they're just trying to justify it. If my spouse would have been this way, I would have never had to have an affair. And I know I've said this before in other podcasts, but there are millions of people that are married, and there are lots of marriages that never have infidelity in it. And every marriage has struggles, but not every marriage and not every person chooses to have an affair. There were plenty of things wrong I saw wrong with my marriage, and I never chose once to go outside of my marriage. So if you have problems with your marriage, it's going to experience infidelity. No, it has to do with that person having the affair. So don't believe the lie. Oftentimes when men are betrayed, especially sexually, the loss of control can feel profound. So when a spouse has a sexual affair, there's emotional affairs, there's lots of different types of affairs, but I think sexual affairs maybe for men are more painful. I don't know. I think emotional affairs are just as painful. All affairs are a different level of pain, but they're all painful. But there's a lot of emotional withdrawal from your spouse. And so you're just wondering what's going on. And men naturally are like, okay, I guess she doesn't want to talk to me about it. We're programmed lots of different ways around men and women. And so they disconnect too, not realizing why. Rigid rules and demands. I totally see this with women doing this to their spouse when they've had the affair, that they make all these weird rules and demands, and the spouse is like, what? I didn't do anything wrong. What are you doing? Because they're trying to control their spouse's narrative so they don't have to feel so bad. Shutting down vulnerability. They totally shut off. And they oftentimes try to manage the relationship. This isn't indifference. It's your nervous system trying to regain stability through structure. I think women are trying to, when they've had an affair with the man, they're just trying to regulate themselves and then put all of it onto their husband. So there are many things that are different, but also lots of things that are similar. I think after your spouse has had an affair, you have this innate fear that you're going to get blindsided again because it feels so out of nowhere. Now, sometimes people start sensing like something feels off with my wife or husband, but they're not sure what it is because in their mind, their spouse would never do something like that. They completely trust their spouse. Of course you trust them. You married them. You had babies with them. Your whole financial world, you've bought a house with them. Like your entire life is with this person. They are your person. So our brain doesn't go there at first. And so when it happens, you get so blindsided, you're terrified that you're going to get blindsided again. You feel powerless. If I could have done something different, then this wouldn't have happened. But I guarantee it was not about you, but you still feel that way. And I get that. You feel abandoned. And I talk to a lot of people that feel discarded or abandoned. And I just want you to know, if you feel this way, it's a miserable way to feel, but don't abandon yourself. You have power over yourself. That's the muscle you've got to work on, not what they think about you or not, because they clearly made a very poor choice that caused so many problems for so many people. Oftentimes feel foolish or unsafe, which is very common. How could I have not seen it? How will I ever feel safe again? I don't know if I can even lay next to this person, let alone hold their hand, or they feel very dangerous to me. It feels like a bear was attacking you, and now the bear is trying to give you a hug, and that feels very dangerous. So just know, true controlling behaviors become harmful when it crosses the line, monitoring and surveillance. This is important right at first, but if you're monitoring and surveilling for years, you need to get help. This is hurting more than helping you and your marriage if you've decided to stay married. This is unhelpful. This will hurt you more than help you heal and rebuild trust. Isolation and support systems. If you find yourself isolating and not talking to anyone, you need at least a friend, a coach, a therapist, at least one person. If you don't have one person, you need to find someone, because when you isolate, you spin in your head and you're going to create worse problems for yourself. If there's financial restriction going on, if you're not able to even pay for your basic needs, that's a problem. That's a sign of control. Gaslighting and manipulation is huge. They're gaslighting, telling you you're crazy. You didn't see what you saw. You don't know what you're talking about. If you tell anyone, I'm going to do this, right? So much gaslighting and manipulation. That's when it's gone too far. That's when the control is too much. Emotional intimidation. Quit crying. Like, why can't you get over it? It's been a week. Get over it. It takes longer than a week, longer than a month. I'm going to say a couple years to fully heal from betrayal. And that is doing consistent work. That's just not reading an Instagram post, reading a book. That is getting proper help from a coach, a therapist, talking about it. So if these tactics are being used, that is controlling behavior. If you have an environment where you cannot talk to your partner freely, if you can only talk about certain things, this is a problem, because oftentimes as the betrayed, you need to talk, as well as the betrayer. They need to talk too. So we have to give equal airtime. We have to listen. We have to hear what they have to say. And when you're dysregulated, you're going to have a really hard time doing this. Controlling partners don't see themselves as controlling. And so that's why I think having a coach is so powerful, because if you are controlling, a coach is going to help you see that. We often can't see what we're doing wrong or right, or that's helpful or hurtful in ourselves. It's so much easier to see what other people are doing wrong and harder for us to see what we're doing wrong. So that's why it's helpful to have someone that's a neutral person. Your mom's also not going to be the one to tell you, because she's supportive of you and he's a jerk or she's a jerk. That's unhelpful. So having a neutral person, a coach, therapist, very helpful. Oftentimes they use the reason like, oh, I'm just being protective or helpful or reasonable. So we're making up lies for ourselves or for them. And that's what's so confusing about this. So oftentimes there's reasons why people become controlling. The psychological reason is it's an attempt to regulate overwhelming internal anxiety. Anxiety is a huge issue for people. Their anxiety, they're trying to manage it through you. They have a low self-esteem, or they have a fear of abandonment. A lot of these issues come from childhood, and they're trying to manage those emotions through controlling you. And it's very destructive and will not be helpful. They have childhood trauma. They grew up in a very chaotic or unsafe home. I think we need to talk a lot more about how were you raised in your childhood and what have you done to heal from it. And if you haven't done anything, if you're like, oh, I'm going to ignore my childhood, that is unhelpful. And getting help, it's not like you have to relive your entire childhood. It's just almost about making peace with it and understanding, oh, these are behaviors I learned to try to keep myself safe. Oftentimes people were parentified. They were parentified as children. I see this in one of my daughters. I depended on her a lot to help me with her brothers. And it's painful that I did that, but I did. And so now as an adult, she needs to heal that and repair that. Control becomes a substitute for emotional safety. So someone's trying to get emotionally safe by controlling. You need to recognize that. If you're realizing you're trying to control, notice these tendencies, and the more you're aware of them, the more you can change. If your control loosens when you learn to tolerate uncertainty. People don't like uncertainty, but the more you can tolerate it, you can learn to regulate your nervous system, which is something I teach in my coaching program. I want everyone in the world to know how to regulate their nervous system. It will change your life. Communicate fear instead of acting it out. Talk about it. Speak about it. Allow your partner autonomy without equating it to danger. We are two individual people that need to be living our lives together. Can you do that? Can you differentiate between the two? Or are we just trying to control them at all times? Healing starts when control is replaced with self-trust, not monitoring. We have to learn how to trust ourselves. If you feel like you're controlled by your partner, these are some things that you can do. You need to identify what behavior is not okay and acknowledge it. You don't need to tell them like you're doing it wrong. Just know it's not okay. Setting firm, respectful boundaries will change your life. They're helpful, not hurtful. Following through when boundaries are crossed. So when someone crosses your boundary, hey, if you yell at me, I'm going to leave the room. You have to leave the room. You can't just not leave the room because they're going to be like, oh, she doesn't really mean what she says. Practicing saying no without you don't need a reason all the time, right? We want to have people get our reasons for saying no. It's none of their business, really. Maintaining your friendships, interest, and independence is so important. If you find yourself, you don't have any friends or your only interests are your spouse's interests, that could be a sign like, okay, maybe there's more control in my marriage than I thought. Recognizing your worth without needing permission. Control loses power when you stop giving your autonomy away to keep the peace. So are you staying firmly in who you are? I totally was not in my marriage, and I am rebuilding that now, and it feels amazing. And I want you to have that same feeling and hope. So just remember, control is often a substitute for safety, but it isn't going to create it. Safety comes from honesty, accountability, emotional regulation, mutual respect, choice, not coercion. So after betrayal, the work is about who has control. It's about learning how to feel safe without taking it from someone else. That skill you can learn. Anyways, friends, I hope this helps. If you like this podcast, share it with your family and friends, and I'll talk to you next week.